I'm Sathnam Sanghera. I'm a journalist for The Times and also the author of several books about the British Empire. So I'm here today to talk about the legacies of the British Empire. It's all around us. It's here in our multiculturalism, in our racism, in our museums, in our geopolitical chaos. And these are things I didn't understand until my mid-40s. So hopefully the students who are coming to see me today will have a head start. Curiosity is something that you are encouraged to develop at school, but actually I think it's something you need to hold on to for your whole life. So I'm learning stuff literally today that I didn't know yesterday, and hopefully that continues until my dying day.
I'm delighted to introduce Sathnam Sanghera, a renowned author and journalist most famous for his novels focusing on themes such as identity, British history and race. Sanghera was born to Punjabi parents in the West Midlands and entered the school system unable to speak English and graduated from Cambridge with a first-class degree in English literature and language. He's been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards twice for his memoir, The Boy with the Top Knot, and his novel, Marriage Material, named My Book of the Year in 2009. His third book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, was an instant Sunday Times bestseller when released in 2021 and was named Book of the Year at the 2022 British Book Awards. This work succeeds not only in providing vital historical knowledge, but bridging the gap between the past and present to encourage conversation about the complexity of Britain's cultural history and legacy, particularly in relation to colonisation. As a politics student myself, and as we focus on global politics, I find it incredibly poignant to study the history of Britain and the lasting impacts its empire has left on large areas of the modern world. Please join me in welcoming Sathnam Sanghera.
Thanks for inviting me to Croydon today to talk about the legacies of the British Empire. I've been talking and writing about this subject for around 6 or 7 years now, and if there's one thing I've learned is that if you want to have a fight, talk about Manchester City, or talk about trans issues, or talk about the British Empire. It's one of the most poisonous subjects out there. There's very little about the biggest empire in human history that isn't contentious in some way. So, for example, people argue about what drove the British Empire. Was it driven by the desire to make money? Was it driven by the desire to spread British values? Was it driven by the fact that we wanted to beat the Dutch and the French? Or did it just happen because parts of the world were there and we just wanted to conquer them because we could? People also argue about when it ended. Did it end with the independence of India on the 15th of August, 1947? Or did it end in the handing back of Hong Kong on the 1st of July, 1997? Or maybe, some people argue, it never ended. People also argue about when it reached its peak and how large the British Empire actually got. According to one estimate, at its height, the British Empire covered nearly 14 million square miles. That is an area equivalent to a quarter of the Earth's land surface at its height in 1923. This is more than twice the area of the largest country in the world today, which is Russia. And some people argue that actually it was even bigger at other times. It depends on how you define what was a part of the empire and when. Meanwhile, some people also question whether the British Empire even happened at all. This is quite a strange argument. One of those people who put forward this argument is a man called Enoch Powell. He was a former MP from my hometown of Wolverhampton. He was famous for a bunch of things, but mainly for making a speech called the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. It was a famously racist speech. But in a really weird twist, he was an imperialist, and his whole life had been shaped by the idea of empire. But he started to claim from 1960 onwards that the British Empire had been a myth, that it never really existed, that it was a deception and, quote, an invention all along. He said that the fact that people had ever believed that the British Empire existed was, quote, one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in political history. He also insisted that England underwent no organic change as the mistress of a world empire. It was a very strange thing to say, especially for a man whose entire mission in life, his mission was to be the Viceroy of India. He was a man who in 1947, when Britain was accepting that India had to be given independence, he tried to persuade Winston Churchill to impose martial law on India to hold on to India on behalf of the British. But the thinking behind it relates to something that a man called Sir John Seeley once said. He was the founding father of imperial history. He went to the same college that I went to at Cambridge. And he famously asserted in a book called The Expansion of England that, quote, "The British Empire was acquired in a fit of absence of mind." He argued, like many have since, that there was no mission behind the British Empire. It wasn't deliberate. It kind of happened by accident. It was a consequence of unintentional events and responses to unintentional events. And if you believe that, it's not too far to then argue that the empire never really existed. But for its worth, and this may not come as a surprise to you, given I have been booked today to talk about the British Empire, I do believe the British Empire existed. It happened. So let's get that out of the way. It shaped the world in all sorts of really profound ways, and you can see some of the evidence just sitting here in this quite dark but mercifully cool room. Not least, there's this school. This may not be one of the most famous public schools in Britain, but it is a public school, and all such schools have had their culture shaped by the British Empire. Britain's public schools began to really thrive in the Victorian age, when many of them were established because they served as a preparation to serve in the empire. A school like Uppingham saw 1/3 of its leavers depart England for opportunities in the empire. Meanwhile, Eton, I'm sure you've heard of Eton, produced those destined for the highest echelons. So a lot of the famous viceroys of India came from Eton, including Lord Curzon. And newer public schools like Clifton usually trained men who took up lowlier but still very prestigious positions in the empire. Below this, there are a bunch of other schools, including this school, which helped sustain recruitment across the empire. Victorian public schools didn't exist exclusively to produce staff for empire, but their focus on the values of fair play, resilience, and duty made them perfect for the task. And of these values, the most important one, the one they were obsessed with, was fair play. I don't know if you come across this in the course of your education, but this was the 19th century notion of, wherever possible, according indigenous people and local tradition respect and observance whilst you were still ruling over them. It was famously articulated by the Victorian author Sir Henry Newbolt, who in his famous 1897 poem about a schoolboy cricketer, as an adult travelled to Africa to battle for empire. Also, many of the sports that you play today at this school, and I've looked at your Wikipedia entry, you're quite good at it, almost all of them began in empire and were spread across the world by the British Empire. So cricket, hugely popular in India today, basically because the British introduced it back in the 18th century. The majority of countries that today play football, even in South America, had it introduced to them directly or indirectly by the British Empire. Tennis, croquet, hockey, polo, these are all sports that thrived during the British Empire and were spread around the world. But that's not the extent of it. In my cup here, Audrey has bought for me a cup of Yorkshire tea. And guess what? Yorkshire tea does not come from Yorkshire. You might have guessed that. As the Yorkshire Tea website explains, if you have a look, the tea bags, and as the same is true for most tea bags, is a blend of tea that comes from different parts of the world. Almost all of those parts of the world were formerly part of the British Empire. And often it was the British who started tea plantations in those parts of the world in the first place. People in India often think Indians have always been drinking tea, but actually in 1900, if you went to India, almost no one was drinking tea. If it's now become a national drink in India and in England, it's because the British could make money out of it, and they introduced it and made it popular and made a fortune out of it. If it was a bit later in the evening, I could have perhaps been drinking something alcoholic from the headmaster's bar. And there's a bunch of alcoholic drinks that have their origins in the empire, the most famous one being gin and tonic. The tonic in gin and tonic contains quinine. And quinine is the chemical that allowed imperialists to survive the worst effects of malaria in West Africa. That one chemical, which comes from the bark of a tree in South America, meant that the whole of West Africa could be colonized by Europeans. And then there's rum and coke, very popular drink with me as a sixth former. Rum has its origins in the British Empire. Molasses, which are the residue left over after sugar is produced from cane juice, this was a drink developed originally out of molasses in Barbados, where the British industrialized the production of sugar using the enslaved. And rum was a product of all the people who were living there. The Europeans, the British, the Africans all came together to produce this very famous drink. And looking at where your school is located, there's another imperial legacy, if you don't go far from here, in the form of the South Downs National Park. Imperial Britons often saw themselves as stewards of the environment, defending the natural world. So organizations like the Society for the Preservation of the Fauna of the Empire, which is a charity that exists today under a snappier name, Fauna and Flora International, they convened international conferences, created game reserves, and also helped create the idea of national parks, which were launched by the British in places like New Zealand and Africa. Plans for national parks began in the 1930s in East Africa, and having been put on hold during the war, were completed immediately after it. These imperial parks in Africa then paved the way for similar initiatives back in Britain in the form of the 1949 National Parks Act, which provided for the opening up of a bunch of national parks, including the one down the road. There's other imperial legacies probably in your day-to-day school day, in your curriculum. The field of geography relied on European imperialism to develop as a subject. When imperialists went out to conquer the world, they needed maps, and hence geography was born. And actually, geography existed as an academic subject before history. History came afterwards. Also, bizarrely, the intense study of English literature as a subject began in India before it began in Britain. English wasn't really taken seriously as an academic subject. That's what I did at university. The classics and history were considered more seriously. And actually, when Shakespeare was first taught in Britain, the teaching materials that kids used were teaching materials from India, because that Shakespeare was being studied in India before it was studied in Britain, which is quite a strange idea when you think about it. Another great legacy of the British Empire, of course, is in the racial diversity of the room. I actually wrote that before I saw you guys, but I'm reassured that you are incredibly racially diverse as a reflection of Croydon and London. And one of the main reasons London, Britain, Croydon are so multicultural is because of the British Empire. Because your parents, your grandparents had a connection to Britain, and Britain had a connection to those places, so they came over here. It often gets forgotten, but the passengers on the Windrush ship who arrived here famously in 1948 came as British citizens. The 1948 Nationality Act, an amazing piece of legislation, it enacted what had been true for decades, that anyone born in the empire had the rights of a British citizen. This piece of legislation was crazy because it gave 600 million people in empire the right to come to Britain. It was crazy. I think people who wrote the legislation didn't expect people to come. But then they did, and then ever since they've been trying to undo that legislation. But there's a famous line that explains what I've just been saying, and the line is, "We are here because you are there." The reason this country is so brown and black is because Britain was looking after a very racially diverse empire. And this is a huge legacy, probably the biggest thing that's happened in our lifetimes, but it's still small fry when you think about the global legacies of the British Empire. Yes, we have millions of people of colour now living in Britain because of the British Empire, but the British Empire also enslaved 3 million Africans, sent them across the Atlantic to work in plantations in the Caribbean and so on. So that's 3 million people, and then their descendants. We're talking about tens of millions of people today whose lives have been permanently shaped by this history. In Ireland, an estimated 1 million people died during the potato famine under British rule in the 1840s, and many, many more were uprooted and resettled abroad. The population of Ireland still hasn't recovered from that British imperial policy. Apparently, it might recover by 2030. Apparently, the British Empire was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people between 1838 and 1880 during the first Afghan War, the first Opium War, the Indian Uprising, the second Opium War, the second Afghan War, and the 1878 to 1880 wars in South Africa. Partition, which is a definitive event in the history of India and Pakistan, some 15 million people were displaced as a result of partition, and up to 2 million people died. Recent research has revealed that in Australia, another British territory, there were at least 270 organised massacres of First Nations people. And as a result of that, the population of Indigenous people there was decimated, which means that by the end of it, there were about 10% of the same people living in that part of the world. So the population went from around 1.5 million to around 100,000 by the start of the 20th century. There was the annihilation of the Indigenous people of the Caribbean, the genocide of the Indigenous people of the Tasmania. On top of that, the British sent 1 million Indians to plantations around the world, to places like Mauritius, Guyana, Trinidad. And this was to replace the enslaved that were working for the British for free once slavery had been abolished. And it's one of the main reasons why wherever you go in the world, whichever airport you're in, there's lots of Indians. It's partly because the British just sent a lot of Indians all around the place to do that work. And the other thing that gets forgotten, that actually British people, because of the British Empire, British people travelled like no other people. One of the main reasons you see British people wherever you go in the world is because we have a history of travelling. And you probably wouldn't guess that because the media obsession in Britain today is all about immigrants coming here. We don't think about all the British people who went out and populated all sorts of places. And there's legacies beyond all the ones I've listed so far. You can feel the legacy of the empire in the daily lives of people around the planet. It explains, the British Empire explains the spread of the English language, explains patterns of global tax avoidance, explains the popularity of Christianity in West Africa. It explains the existence of entire nations, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Pakistan. These are countries that would not exist if it wasn't for the British Empire. The creation of entire cities, Nairobi, which was created as part of the building of the railway in East Africa. Colonial Bombay was set up by the British, or the growth came because of the British. The establishment of tropical medicine created by the British. The global system of time. If you ever wondered why the GMT line goes to London, that is largely because of the British Empire. Ganja, which is a herb that hopefully none of you have had any experience of yet. It's an innately Jamaican idea, ganja, but actually it's an Indian word, if you think about it. It's weed, marijuana, so in case you're confused. It's so associated with Jamaica, but actually it was Indian indentured labourers sent by the British to Jamaica who introduced it there. And also explains why in Jamaica people eat goat curry. And there's all sorts of Indian connections to Jamaican culture. The birth of international law arguably came because of the British. But also, there's so many things happening in the news every single day that can be explained by the British Empire. So the current situation in Israel-Palestine is one that we helped to create when we were in charge of the region after World War II. Essentially what happened, and it was a very complicated history, but when we were in charge, we simultaneously promised that part of the world to the Zionist Jews and also to the Arabs in some very unprofessional correspondence. Even at the time, people were saying this is going to result in war, and it did almost immediately. There's currently an international dispute raging about the borders of Guyana, with Venezuela threatening to invade Guyana. That's all goes down to the way in which the borders were drawn during the British Empire. There's serious calls for reparations in the Caribbean. That goes back to slavery and the empire. We're currently bombing Yemen, as we were 100 years ago for very similar reasons. You could argue that Donald Trump's foreign policy, as deranged as it is, in many ways was inspired by the British Empire. He wants to invade Canada, he wants to invade the Panama Canal, he wants to turf the indigenous communities out of their reservations. He's quite keen on the white supremacy that the 19th century imperialists were keen on. And you could argue with some of the points I've made here, but I think what you can't argue with is that you need to understand the history of the British Empire in order to understand the news and in order to understand the modern world. You needed to understand your daily life. But as I talk about all of this, I realize that some of you will have a very specific question in mind when you think about the legacies of the biggest empire in human history. And that question is this, because I get it all the time, is overall, were the legacies of the British Empire good or bad? I know some of you are thinking this, because this is the way the British have always talked about the British Empire. It goes back to the 1800s. And people were debating this as the British Empire was happening. And in more recent decades, almost every book about the British Empire has been along these lines. So we had Neil Ferguson's book on empire, which argued that overall, the legacies of the British Empire were good. And then you had books by Kwasi Kwarteng and Sashi Thoreau. You might have seen Sashi Thoreau's video about the British Empire. And they argue that overall, the legacies were bad. 2 elections ago, we had Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, arguing that under his party, children will be taught about the, quote, historical injustice of the British Empire as part of the national curriculum. At the same time, we had the Conservative Minister, Michael Gove, arguing that history lessons in schools needed to celebrate the legacy of the British Empire. And this kind of black and white way of viewing this very complicated history has got us nowhere and still gets us nowhere. It's a bit like saying, I want to study the climate over the last 300 years, but I only want to focus on the sunshine, or I only want to focus on the rain. Most of the interesting weather it happens in between. And I would say this is very similar for the history of the British Empire. It's a very strange way of viewing history. You wouldn't say, let's look at the history of Henry VIII and let's decide whether he was a good monarch or a bad monarch, because history is complicated. And if you're trying to balance the good and bad with the aim of coming to an overall conclusion about the greatness of the evil of empire, it leads to some really absurd logic. So you could say, look, how many miles of Indian railway built by the British Empire make up for the 2 million people who died in partition? It's not really a sensible equation. How many of the votes, cast in Nigerian elections since independence make up for the hundreds of thousands of people who died as a result of the way in which the British set up that country? At which precise point did the capitalist prosperity introduced by British imperialists in North America begin to balance out all the deaths for the millions of indigenous people who died through disease and settler violence? How many of the animals that were saved as a result of the national parks introduced by the British make up for the environmental damage that the British caused around the world? And this view of British imperial history, where our national history is forever being given an overall rating, like it's a phone case that you bought on Amazon, where apples are forever being compared with pears, where human lives are balanced against technological achievement, it just feels more absurd than ever, and it still persists. Even today, you get A-level papers where the essay question might be, tell me whether overall the British Empire was good or bad. And I think we really need to stop viewing this history in this way, because ultimately the legacies are deeply contradictory. The British Empire resulted in the establishment of democracy in a whole bunch of places, in India, Australia, Canada, but also it resulted in massive geopolitical chaos in places like Nigeria, Sudan, Iraq, Palestine, Kashmir. It's a very long list. The British Empire sometimes spread the rule of law in a very positive way, but it also institutionalized legal inequality around the world in ways that means that millions of people, even today, can't bank on justice. The British Empire, at its height in the 19th century, was a propagator of racism. The people at the time would not have denied it. They were really into it and proud of it. But it also fostered racial cooperation. It witnessed a spread of anti-racism in response to it, and sometimes the people in London were taking on the racist settlers in places like Australia for their extreme racism. The British Empire both destroyed and saved large parts of the global environment. It spread the free press, but it also spread press censorship. It saw the mass destruction and construction of buildings. It combated and propagated hunger. It both encouraged education and willful ignorance. And I know some of you will struggle with the idea that opposite things can be true at once. I really struggle with this idea once, but I think it's the only logical place that you're going to end up if you study this history. And, you know, it's something I've changed my mind about. When I first began looking at the history of slavery, for example, you know, the legacies of slavery just seemed to be straightforwardly bad. 3 million Africans sent across the Atlantic, and all the negative things associated with that. And when we abolished slavery, you know, we only liberated 800,000 people. So clearly, you know, slavery is worse than abolition. But this can lead to all sorts of strange arguments where you see people arguing, saying, look, we abolished slavery, so therefore, yes, 800,000 people were liberated, but also we stopped millions of other people from being enslaved. So therefore, abolition, the legacies of abolition are more powerful than the legacies of slavery. And it leads to, people could argue that, look, you know, because of the animal and nature conservations that the British got into, the British actually ended up saving more animals than they destroyed. These arguments are very circular, and they don't really get us anywhere, and they're not particularly illuminating. And I think we've got to try to stop balancing things with other things, otherwise we'll be driven mad. It's much better to simply accept slavery, anti-slavery, the destruction and preservation of animals and nature as phenomena in their own right, and to attempt to understand their complicated stories. It's much better to try at every stage to seek nuance and to come to, rather than trying to come to some kind of generalized overall conclusion, because opposite things can be true at the same time. British Empire was ultimately a mass of contradictions, and its legacies are highly contradictory too. And I really do think that the idea that opposite things can be true at the same time can liberate us, not only in our understanding of history, but also in our understanding of people and in our understanding of politics. And if you struggle with this idea, I would say, why don't you just look at your own family? You know, we love our families, but equally we find them the most annoying people on the planet. And that is an idea, I think, that can liberate you in all sorts of things. But having said that, there are opposites within the opposites. History can get very complicated. There are certain facts about the British Empire which are incontrovertibly uncomplex. So when it comes to an institution like the royal family, for example, it's perfectly possible to observe that their involvement in slavery far outweighs their involvement in abolition. But whenever it comes to generalizing about the British Empire as a whole, whatever you say about it, the opposite is almost true to a certain degree. To how much of a degree? Often it's unknowable, but accepting anything else will eventually tie you into intellectual knots. And there's no better example of this than Jan Morris, who wrote probably the most famous trilogy of books about the British Empire. And it was a very influential set of books. Boris Johnson's favourite book, David Cameron's favourite book, influenced a whole generation of politicians, very nostalgic and quite positive about the British Empire. But at the end of her life, she was asked how she felt about those books. And she said, you know what, I'm ashamed. And it seems like a bizarre, contradictory thing to say, but I do think this history does lead you to those kind of contradictions because, you know, it was crazy. The history was really, really, really complicated. At the same time as saying all this, I do think that for too long, historians have for too long approached this history from the point of view of the colonizers and ignored the colonized. Understanding that opposites can be true at the same time, it doesn't stop us from observing that imperialists made concerted efforts to repress evidence about what happened at the time. It doesn't stop us from observing that there is now an organized, well-funded campaign to shut down discussion of slavery and empire in Britain. You see it in the right-wing press, you see it in Donald Trump's America almost every single day. It doesn't stop us from observing that anyone who attempts to talk about this history with real nuance is shouted down by culture warriors of various stripes who are keen on propagating very simple views of this history. And it doesn't stop us observing that we need to pay more attention to what the nations formerly in the empire are trying to tell us about what the British Empire did to them, how it shaped their lives and their development. So I would encourage you to not have a monochromatic way of viewing this history, to challenge yourselves if you find yourself drawn to a very simple explanation, because I bet you there will always be a counter-argument. You should try to seek nuance wherever it is available. I'm going to stop there because my voice is slightly going. I think I'm going to take some questions now from the students. Here. Yes? Thank you. So you guys are politics students? Yeah. Okay. Politics, history, they overlap.
Yeah.
When you talk about history, you're often talking about politics. When you talk about empire, you're definitely talking about politics.
Yeah. So you speak of selective amnesia, and just now and in the book you mentioned Michael Gove's call for the British curriculum to celebrate the British Empire. And how do you pair with the two of these things? How do you feel about so-called British values and the insistence on teaching it in schools?
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about British values, politicians assume we all know what that means. But what do British values mean? I mean, the Victorians, when they were spreading British values and they were really into it, for them, British values were white supremacy. I mean, they were proud of it. There's a poem called White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, which articulates how they felt. For them, British values were anti-slavery. But then that led to the British value of more colonialism. The idea where we are so great, actually you should let us colonize you. It's not dissimilar to what Donald Trump is now saying to large parts of the world. And when the Daily Telegraph talks about British values, it means certain things. When the Guardian talks about British values, it means the opposite. You could say that belief in the empire as a British empire is a value. You know, if you do particularly well in your life, you might get an MBE, which has the word empire in it. But I would argue that actually opposing the empire is also a British value, because some very famous people opposed the British Empire right from the beginning, throughout. The abolitionists who got slavery abolished, I'd say that was a British value. Prime Minister William Gladstone, he opposed a lot of the excesses of empire. George Orwell worked in the empire. He hated it. Probably the most articulate writer on empire. So I would say the problem with the phrase British values is that it can mean opposite things. And yeah, you've got to interrogate it that when people use that phrase, because you've got to work out what they mean.
Because we're having a conversation about British values in class sometimes, and I don't think anyone could answer, and we couldn't pin it down.
Some things are easy, like
yeah.
tea, sarcasm, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what else is there. I would say multiculturalism is. I would say. Nigel Farage wouldn't, right? But I think until now, most politicians would say our diversity and our tolerance is a real British value. But yeah, these things are being challenged all the time. Thank you for your question.
Considering India was effectively colonized by a private corporation,
It was colonized.
does this make it a more morally questionable than other forms of imperialism? And do you think it has made it more difficult for Britain to acknowledge this aspect of their history?
Well, this is one of the reasons why people don't understand the British Empire very easily, because when the Raj began, when the British Empire really took off, it was a company, the East India Company. And I found that very confusing. It's like, hold on, was it a company or was it a state? Or was it colonization or was it just a business deal? And what you need to remember about the East India Company is that that was the point. Sowing the confusion was the point, because it allowed them to get away with things. So when it was convenient for the East India Company, they would be like, oh, we're just a company. Don't worry about us. We're just a corporation. But when necessary, they were like, actually, we are the British state. And that got them. But obviously, it wasn't a conventional company, because it had an army twice the size of the British Army. And I would say, to understand the East India Company, actually the best analogy now is probably the tech companies, because these companies are not only hugely powerful, Amazon, all the Google and so on, they also trade in monopolies, which is what the East India Company was into. They're often doing quite malevolent stuff. So I'd say tech companies now are undermining our mental health, causing race riots on our streets, spreading disinformation, undermining liberal democracy. East India Company was selling opium to the Chinese illegally, causing wars, the Indian Mutiny resulting in the death of thousands of people. So they were similarly malevolent, but I guess Amazon hasn't got an army, but who knows? You watched the inauguration of Donald Trump, and you saw all those tech CEOs lined up, and that's very similar to the East India Company. The East India Company was so important, it became too big to fail. It became part of the state. And you can imagine the same thing happening with Facebook and Google one day. These companies are so important to states around the world that they hold on to them tight. So I think there's a lot of modern parallels. Thank you for that question. Long answer.
I think we're going to ask one more question and then...
Opening out.
One more question here, one more question there, and then opening it to the floor. You mentioned how you view multiculturalism to be like a value of, like a British value, and a lot of sharing of cultures is kind of ingrained in Britain now. But do you think because of the legacy of the British Empire with colonialism, that there's a heightened sense of entitlement to other cultures that kind of borders on appropriation at times?
That's a very good question. Thank you. That's a very good question. Cultural appropriation. Should we talk about that in a bit? I mean, cultural appropriation is interesting. I've seen people who go crazy about the fact that Starbucks serves chai lattes, right? It's annoying for Indians because chai latte is the same word twice, basically. Chai is chai. It has milk in it, you know what I mean? It's like saying milky milk. And they're accused of appropriating Indian culture, and you see this playing out when Jamie Oliver cooks a curry on Channel 4 on his Channel 4 program, right? I personally find I don't get that cross, because all culture is appropriation. If you look, there's nothing indigenous about tea, as I was saying. Indians weren't drinking tea in 1900. It's the British who introduced it to them. Curry, the spices associated with curry actually come from South America. And in the 1600s, when the British first went to India, the food they found was very similar to the food they were eating in London. It was all stews and stuff. So it was that the Indians appropriated international. So almost all culture is appropriated. But having said that, that doesn't mean all cultural appropriation is okay. Having said that, there are polite ways of doing it, and there are offensive ways of doing it. There's ways to do it respectfully and intelligently, and there's ways to be insulting. And we all know it's the tone in which you do it. So when it comes to that subject, I think it's about the tone in which you do it. I think cultural appropriation can be a really great thing, but it has to be done in a non-aggressive, non-colonial way. Yeah.
I know you already mentioned about India and ganja with the indentured labour, but how did the British system of indentured labour serve as an extension of colonial exploitation? And what long-term socio-economic effects did it have on Indian communities, both within India and in overseas settlements?
Oh, the legacy. People don't really know about indenture because people talk about slavery. And I went to Mauritius, which is a society entirely created by indentured labour. And I talked to people there. Even there, they did not understand it. I talked to people and they would say, oh, when my grandfather came as a slave. And it's like, no, that's a different system. Indenture was quite bad. People were doing the similar jobs to the enslaved, but it wasn't as bad because people often got saved, people got paid. Often it was for a limited time. There were ways out of the system. They didn't lose control of their children. And so it wasn't as bad. But the legacies of indenture are really profound. Even today, one of them is the fact that if you look around the world, even today in the modern day, the most exploited people are Indian labourers in places like the Middle East. And sometimes in exactly the same parts of the world where the British introduced indentured labour. So tea plantations in India still have a problem with almost slave labour. And that goes directly back to indentured labour. But a positive legacy is that, when indentured labour came about, because abolition had been fought for, all the people who had got slavery abolished were on the case with these plantations. They were visiting, they were reporting on conditions for the labourers. This actually led to the birth of all sorts of workers' laws, international labour law, which is still in place today. And actually the whole system was shut down much earlier than people wanted, than the planters wanted, because of these campaigners.
Okay, so any questions?
We have some questions.
Can I start with Abigail?
Do you believe that the Commonwealth and having the British royal family as heads of state across the world perpetuates the idea of empire?
Oh yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, that's why it was set up. British lost the empire, they set up the Commonwealth. But I find it hard to get across about, because what is the Commonwealth? You know, it doesn't really make any sense. In the modern day, I think it's 57 countries in the Commonwealth. Not all of them were formerly in the British Empire. Rwanda was never in the British Empire. So you could say, okay, what unites them? Oh, they all share the same head of state. It's not true. I think only 14 of the 57 countries are Commonwealth realms, which means they share the same head of state. So what is the Commonwealth? You could say, okay, it puts on some games every 4 years. But now they're struggling to even do that. Lots of cities in the world don't want to put on the Commonwealth Games. And the biggest problem with the Commonwealth now is that a lot of the countries involved in it want to talk about these issues. They want to talk about the legacies of slavery. They want to talk about getting rid of the monarchy. But the British and the royal family don't want to talk about it. So the one thing it could do, it doesn't want to do. So I think it's really struggling for a purpose. But this has always been the way. Famously, when Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, was talking to his colleagues about joining the Commonwealth, he said, look, we might as well join it because it means nothing anyway. And that's why India joined. And it continues. So it's an institution, yes, it's a legacy of the empire, but also it's so meaningless that maybe it's benign.
At the front right here? Or second?
So you looked a lot about sort of the legacies of empire in modern day British politics. How do you think the legacies of the empire have affected politics in countries that used to be colonies?
Yeah, no, they continue to shape all sorts of the parts of the world. I mean, I mentioned Nigeria, Sudan, Kashmir, Pakistan, Burma, Iraq. These are places in a state of war, lots of them, or have been at a civil war, where the situation had been created by the British. I mean, Kashmir, you've seen in the news this week with India and Pakistan possibly going to nuclear war. That happened because the British sold Kashmir, a majority Muslim state, sold it to a Hindu monarch. Obviously, it was going to result in chaos, and that's what's happened. So there's all sorts of legacies like that. But also, there's also more benign cultural legacies like the English language and so on. And now I've forgotten your question. What was your question again?
How it affects sort of the political discourse.
Oh yeah, so another majority, you see this in all sorts of former imperial territories, is how it's quite useful for politicians in places like India, Zimbabwe, to use the history of British Empire as a demonizing force. So Modi often talks about the 2,000 years of colonialism. It's quite useful to have an enemy to blame everything on. And Robert Mugabe did it a lot in Zimbabwe. And you say, all of our problems come down to the British. And interestingly, when you go to lots of these places and you talk to people and ask them, who are you angry at? Are you angry at the British Empire? Or are you angry at your politicians? And almost always, they're angry at their politicians. In Nigeria, definitely, where I went to for my last book, people are really angry at their politicians. And they thought that the British Empire history was irrelevant. Thank you for your question.
On why Britain specifically became a big empire, was it because of the extraordinary individuals and the sort of great man period history, or was it more because of wider economic and cultural issues that were to Britain?
Again, an excellent question. Why Britain? Why did Britain, this tiny country, end up running the biggest empire in human history? I mean, Russia's had an empire, French, German, everyone's had an empire, and Sikhs had an empire, and they're all kind of faded out, and they were much smaller than the British. What was it about the British? I mean, people argue about this. I mean, you could argue about this for hours. I think it was something to do with our limited resources. We're a small country. Also, it's to do with the fact that we are traditionally good on the seas. So we're good at getting in boats and shooting at people. And so that made us an extrovert nation. So we're always going out. We had to, because we didn't have limitless resources and wealth like other countries, so which tended to look forward. So I think fundamentally it's a reflection of our geography. But other people would say other things. Other people would say, the Victorians would say, it's because we are Christians and we are the best people in the world. That's what the Victorians would say. And other people would have other arguments.
Like in the middle at the back? I think so.
In the middle at the back.
Do you think that like the riches and wealth that were looted from countries in the British Empire should go back to their original countries?
Should the loot that we often see in our museums, I assume, or we see on the King's Head, should it be given back? I would say we need to look at these things case by case. Some things are really obvious, like the stuff we stole from Tibet in 1903, where we machine gunned a bunch of Tibetan monks who had no way to defend themselves, and then we put all that stuff in the British Museum. That we should probably give back. It's a pretty clear case. But something like the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which I'm sure all the Indians here know of, right? It's a diamond that is in the crown jewels. At the time, the biggest diamond in the world. It's the most famous diamond in the world. Stolen or taken from Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the final Sikh emperor. And yeah, it seems on the surface of it, a simple thing to give it back to Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who was asking for it back. But the problem is, the Sikhs, who hate Modi, they want it back too. The Pakistanis, who once owned it, sort of, they want it back. I think the Iranians want it back, because they owned it before Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So in that case, who do you give it back to? Because you're going to create a lot of problems. In that case, I think it actually makes sense to have it in the Tower of London where everyone can see it. But I think you need to go case by case. Not everything in the British Museum needs to go back, and not everything you can make the argument for. Thank you for that. Excellent question. We've got 3 in a row there. Got 1 in the middle.
To what extent do you think the royal family kind of affects the legacy of the empire?
I don't know who I'm looking at. Wave. Oh, there we go. To what, the royal family. The royal family is a very interesting emerging subject, because I don't think even the royal family understood how much their history has been shaped by the empire, but it's been massive. As we've talked about, all the jewels in the crown collection, a lot of them come from the empire. The animal skins in their collection come from animals they shot in the empire. The mahogany furniture, all in the royal palaces, comes from mahogany trees that were torn down to such an extent that a lot of these forests were almost made extinct. But most problematically is the history of slavery. The one institution that sent more enslaved people across the Atlantic than any other in the history of the British slave trade was the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company was chaired by King James in royal palaces. When the enslaved owned by the RAC were sent to places like Barbados, when they arrived, they had their skin branded with the initials of the Duke of York. That's quite something, and it made quite a lot of money for the royal family. It made them very pro-slavery. I mean, a lot of our kings and queens fought abolition. So in this way, you could argue that actually the royal family are probably the most imperial institution in the whole of Britain. And arguably, they haven't done much to face up to that history. King Charles has said he's happy to commission some research, but that's not much compared to what the Dutch royal family are doing. So I would argue the royal family have a lot of work to do, and they need to do it as the head of the Commonwealth, and also they head the modern multicultural British society, which are really interested in these things. So this is history they can't avoid. Next question. Sorry, I've taken over. You choose.
It's okay.
You choose.
Yeah.
You spoke earlier about when the argument of when the British Empire ended. When do you think the British Empire actually ended?
When did it end? Yeah, I mean, the argument that it hasn't ended is that we still, as a country, behave like we run an empire. So we go around lecturing the world on what to do on the environment, human rights, their politics, Israel, Palestine, with very little reflection that we caused a lot of these problems or helped to cause them in the first place. You could argue the fact that we still give out OBEs, MBEs, that in our heads the empire still exists. But I think empire ended in 1997. I think it ended with the handing back of Hong Kong to the Chinese. It's a very interesting thing because I was alive then, and Tony Blair, who handed back Hong Kong to the Chinese, he wrote about it in his memoir, and he described it, and he said, I was only dimly aware of the history, which I find amazing, because the Chinese, they weren't just dimly aware. Every Chinese person at school learns about the Opium Wars, the century of humiliation. They know what the British did. But then the British handing back a colony, the Prime Minister, he doesn't know the history. And that's what I find shocking. And I think that shows you the level of ignorance in this country. And, at your age, I knew nothing about the British Empire. So you're way ahead of me. I was in my 40s. So you're lucky to be born at a time where these issues are finally being talked about. Thank you for your question.
How far would you say did the British come actual UK now participate in neocolonialism? Because the French, they still have military bases across the Sahel and influence it quite a lot, even though they're technically independent.
Yeah.
How far would you say that the British are involved in this?
Well, we still have some colonies, or what do they call them? There's a word. The British are very good at coming up with words to disguise the fact that they're an empire. So they talk about having a mandate, a dominion, a territory. I think they call them overseas territories now, right? So it's the Falklands. I think we obviously given back Hong Kong. A lot of places like Bermuda and all these tax evasion colonies. They're quite useful. Having the connection to Britain, but being semi-independent is a very useful way to hide money. So I would say, in terms of international finance, the British Empire is still very much alive and well. But in terms of geographical area, it's obviously almost entirely gone. There's not much. Yeah. But these small colonies are still hugely influential. And you've been hearing about the Chagos Islands, probably, which, just off Mauritius. And we're only just giving them back. And it's obviously the site of a major American military base. And this shows you how colonies don't need to be big to be important now. You can have tiny spaces around the world, but you can have military bases, they can be places to avoid taxes, and so they can be hugely influential in terms of the way the world works. Thank you.
One last question.
Okay. You pick it. It's quite hard to pick it's quite hard to point, isn't it? I'm going to go, should I pick it?
Yeah.
The guy, you all have the same uniform on. It doesn't help. Glasses, hand up in the air. Yes, you. Thank you.
So you said how it's new opposed to British Empire, but where that was a British value. Do you think people freedom fighters were doing British values people like Gandhi, South Africa, those guys, do you think they were doing a British value or against
That's such a good question. So your question was, are people like the people who were seen as freedom fighters in the time of empire, like Gandhi, Mandela? He was more anti-Boer. But all those people, can you argue that they were expressing British values? It might seem an absurd thing to say. I would say some of them, yes, because look, go to Parliament Square, right? There's a lot of statues there. One is a statue of Winston Churchill, famous British imperialist, but also nearby, there's a statue of Gandhi. So clearly, at some point, the British establishment has seen something in Gandhi that they see as a British value. But we need to remember that at the time, he very much was not seen as British. You know, he was jailed. But weirdly, he himself, when he started out, had very British values. He was quite into the British Empire when he was a lawyer. He was trained, I think, in London, and he worked in South Africa. He believed in a lot of British values. And there's people in India who see him as not being Indian enough now. You know, there were people much more radical than him. And they are the people who are now having statues built by people like Modi. So that, I think the biggest statue in the world is one that Modi built for, I can't remember his name, but it's a very big statue. But he sided with Hitler against Britain. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Good work.